What if the toughest cowboys on screen were hiding the biggest secrets off it? The men who rode into town with grit in their eyes and iron in their voices were sold as the ultimate symbols of American strength. But Hollywood was a place of rules, illusions, and carefully managed stories. Somewhere between the dust, the wide hats, and the studio smiles, other lives were quietly lived. And once you start pulling that thread, the Western myth begins to shift in ways you may not expect. Claude Jarman Jr. He was introduced to audiences as the perfect frontier boy, wide-eyed, polite, and honest, the kind of young face Hollywood loved to place against open land and big skies. Claude Jarman Jr. broke out in Western-leaning stories that framed him as the future of American manhood. Studios saw him as safe, dependable, clean, sure, and that was exactly the image they needed to protect. But growing up inside that image came at a cost. As Jarman aged into adult roles, the expectations followed him. He was supposed to grow into a rugged leading man, the kind who could ride, command a room, and never raise questions. Hollywood at the time had no room for nuance, especially not for actors whose private lives didn't match the fantasy being sold to the audience. Behind the scenes, Jarman lived quietly and cautiously. Friends later recalled how careful he was with words, with gestures, with trust. This was an era when one wrong rumor could stall a career overnight. Western actors were expected to embody a very specific kind of strength, and anything outside that narrow lane was treated as a risk studios didn't want to manage. Eventually, Jarman stepped away from acting and moved into work behind the camera. It was there, away from the constant scrutiny, that he finally found breathing room. Years later, after Hollywood had changed and the old rules had lost their grip, Jarman spoke honestly about his life. Not with bitterness, not with drama, just clarity. What makes his story powerful isn't scandal or shock, it's contrast. The contrast between the wide-open freedom Westerns promised on screen and the tight control actors lived under in reality. Jarman didn't burn bridges or fight the system publicly, he simply waited it out. And in doing so, he became something rare in classic Hollywood history, a Western star who survived, stepped away on his own terms, and lived long enough to tell the truth without fear. That quiet patience may not look like bravery at first glance, but in that era, it absolutely was. Richard Boone didn't play gentle cowboys. He played men who felt carved out of stone, sheriffs with sharp eyes, authority figures who didn't ask twice. His presence was heavy, commanding, and unmistakably tough. When Boone entered a scene, you knew who was in charge. That image wasn't accidental. Studios leaned into it hard. But Boone was never as simple as the roles suggested. Off-screen, he was well-read, sharp-tongued, and deeply skeptical of Hollywood's fake morality. He questioned authority, he pushed back against studio expectations, and quietly, he lived a life that didn't fit the narrow image sold to the public. Stories from friends and colleagues described Boone as someone who kept his circle small and his private world carefully guarded. And there were long stretches spent outside the United States, especially in Europe, where he felt less watched and less restricted. Those periods weren't just professional choices, they were personal ones. Unlike some of his peers, Boone didn't bother constructing a glossy illusion. He didn't lean into fake romances or loudly play the Hollywood game. He relied on talent and intimidation instead. As long as he delivered on screen, studios asked fewer questions. But make no mistake, the silence around his private life wasn't acceptance, it was a truce. Boone knew the limits. He knew how far honesty could go before it cost him work. So he chose control over confession. What makes Boone's story compelling is how clearly it shows the trade-off Western stars faced. Play the symbol of authority long enough. Why? And people stop asking who you really are. The mask becomes protection. Boone never stood at a podium and explained himself. He didn't need to. His legacy lives in the tension between image and reality. A man who played absolute confidence on screen while navigating a far more complicated world behind it. In classic Hollywood, silence was often mistaken for comfort. In Boone's case, it was strategy. Victor Mature. Victor Mature looked like he was built for frontier legends. Broad shoulders, deep voice, a presence that felt solid and immovable. When he stepped into Western or action roles, the camera treated him like a monument. Studios sold him as pure physical confidence, the kind of man who didn't explain himself and didn't need to. But behind that image was a life Hollywood worked very hard to keep quiet. Mature was deeply private. Why? Even by the standards of his era. He avoided interviews when he could and disliked publicity unless it directly served his work. Studio handlers learned quickly that pushing him too hard only made him withdraw further. That distance helped protect him, but it also fueled rumors that followed him quietly for years. Multiple studio-era biographies mentioned Mature's close relationships with men during long production stretches, especially while working on location far from Hollywood. These weren't flashy social connections. They were consistent, private, and deliberately kept outside the spotlight. The studios knew, they always knew, but Mature's box office draw and unmistakable screen power made him worth protecting. What's striking is how carefully his image was maintained, every photo, every interview line. Shouldn't every public appearance reinforce the same idea? Strength, simplicity, control. Western masculinity at its most traditional. Meanwhile, the real man behind the roles lived with constant awareness of what could be lost if the truth slipped out. Unlike some stars, Mature didn't try to reinvent himself later in life. He didn't write a tell-all. He didn't challenge the system publicly. He simply stepped back when the roles slowed down and lived more quietly. His story highlights one of classic Hollywood's unspoken rules. If you could embody the fantasy perfectly enough, the system would look the other way. But the price was isolation. Victor Mature wasn't hiding because he lacked confidence. He was hiding because the industry demanded it, and for decades, the illusion held. John Ireland. John Ireland had a dangerous edge that audiences could feel instantly. He wasn't polished, he wasn't comforting. He played Western figures who felt unpredictable, sometimes threatening, sometimes magnetic. Directors used him when they needed tension without explanation. He brought something raw that couldn't be trained. Off-screen, that same complexity defined his life. Ireland moved through Hollywood differently than most leading men. He didn't follow the expected path. He challenged studio authority. He spoke his mind. And privately, he refused to limit himself to one version of identity. Friends later described him as someone who lived emotionally wide, even when the world around him demanded narrow definitions. Ireland had relationships with both men and women, though he never labeled himself publicly. Locked in the climate of classic Hollywood, labels themselves were considered dangerous. What mattered was discretion, and Ireland practiced it carefully, even while quietly pushing boundaries in his personal life. Studios tolerated him because he was useful. He added grit to westerns that risked feeling too clean. His presence made stories feel heavier, more grounded. That value bought him freedom others didn't have, but it didn't come without consequences. Ireland was never fully embraced by the studio system. He hovered on the edges of stardom, respected but rarely protected. That partial acceptance reflected how Hollywood treated men who didn't neatly fit into its preferred molds. What makes Ireland's story resonate is how clearly it shows the trade-off between authenticity and security. He chose to live more honestly than most, even if it meant fewer guarantees. On screen, he played men who didn't belong anywhere comfortably. Off-screen, he lived much the same way, and that alignment between role and reality gives his Western performances a weight that still lingers. Yul Brynner didn't just play powerful men, he dominated the screen. Bald head, commanding posture, unmistakable voice. Even in Western settings, he felt larger than the landscape itself. Brynner wasn't sold as a cowboy who blended in. He was sold as a force of nature, confident, untouchable, unapologetic. That image gave him cover. Behind the scenes, Brynner lived far more freely than many of his peers, though never openly. He moved through international circles, spent long periods outside Hollywood, and surrounded himself with artists, writers, and creatives who lived by different rules. In those spaces, he felt safer, less observed, less confined by studio expectations. Biographers have long noted that Brynner's private relationships didn't always align with the narrow story Hollywood told about him. He formed deep emotional bonds with both men and women over the course of his life. The studios were aware, but Brynner's global appeal made him difficult to control. He wasn't dependent on Westerns alone, and that independence mattered. Unlike actors who relied entirely on the cowboy image, Brynner could pivot: epic roles, stage work, international productions. That flexibility allowed him to keep his personal life out of reach without fully retreating into secrecy. What's important is how deliberately he shaped his public persona. Brynner didn't pretend to be relatable. He presented himself as singular, mysterious, almost mythic. That distance discouraged questions. People assumed they knew who he was because he seemed so self-assured. But confidence can be a shield. Brynner's story shows how power in Hollywood wasn't just about contracts or box office numbers, it was about leverage. The more indispensable you were, the more room you had to live quietly on your own terms. He didn't challenge the system, he outgrew it.